Hello and welcome. Welcome to our second virtual festival and our 13th annual Kingston Writers Fest. My name is Trisha Knowles. I'm the marketing director for Kingston Writers Festival, and I am pleased to welcome you to this on-stage event of the festival, Adventuring Within, Reconnecting with Our Deepest Self. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the festival customarily takes place and where I sit today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. The Kingston Indigenous community continues to reflect the area's Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee roots. There is also a significant Métis community as well as First Peoples from other nations across Turtle Island present here today. And I am grateful to connect with you and with nature on this land today. I'd like to take a moment as well to thank the Canada Council, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of the festival. We are incredibly grateful to those organizations and individuals who support the festival, including Maureen Ball and Tom Williams, author patrons of Kirsteen. This event is an hour long and includes a question and answer period. So if you have questions throughout the event, feel free to type them into the Q&A box at any point, and our moderator will direct your questions accordingly. There is also a raise a hand function, or if you're joining us from a mobile device, you can press *9, which will raise your hand, and we can turn to you to join us via phone. As a thank you to continuing to support Kingston Writers Fest and joining us for this virtual edition of the festival, we're going to be randomly selecting a pre-registered participant of every event this year following our Q&As. So please do stay with us. We will award a copy of Kirsteen's book for you at the end of the event. If you'd like to support our authors by picking up copies of their books, our official bookseller is Novel Idea Bookstore in downtown Kingston. Now I am absolutely delighted and privileged to introduce this event's presenter, the lovely Kate Kristiansen. She is the owner of the Hummingbird Studio, a marketing and publicity agency in just outside of Kingston, and has nearly 20 years of experience in marketing, brand sponsorship development. I think we go back about a dozen plus years in this field together. She actually held this very position at Kingston Writers Fest for the 2014 and 2015 festivals. Kate writes about all things food and family, has a strong interest in food security and the farm to table movement, as well as other global issues, a true nature lover. Kate's Up in My Grill column for Kingston Heritage and Frontenac Gazette newspapers share her musings on seasonal food, urban foodie delights, culinary trends, restaurant reviews, local chefs, and life in her kitchen at home. She also freelances for Local Tastes, a food and wine magazine. Kate is also an avid traveler and has traveled around the world, living for several years in New Zealand and across the United States, and never one to sit idle. She is currently working on not one, but 2 novels. She lives in a stunning limestone century home outside Sydenham, Ontario. Please welcome the lovely Kate Kristiansen.
Thank you so much, Trisha. I love these events where it's like a gathering of friends that we haven't seen in a long time. And the author that I'm about to introduce is that. Kirsteen and I met, I think, almost 9 years ago through Kingston Writers Fest. So I'm very proud, and it's my pleasure to introduce her today. So Kirsteen Macleod is the author of the short story collection, The Animal Game. Her fiction, poetry, and creative nonfiction have appeared in prominent literary journals, including the New Quarterly and the Malahat Review. Her articles have been featured in leading Canadian magazines, and her work has been a finalist for the CBC Literary Award in Creative Nonfiction, among other awards. Her newest book, In Praise of Retreat, which can be found at Novel Idea Bookstore in downtown Kingston. Finding Sanctuary in the Modern World explores the history of the retreat across cultures and spiritual practices and reveals the benefits that disconnecting from the modern world can have on our harried existence. Part memoir, part nature essay, and part guidebook. It's very well researched, and I encourage you to pick up a copy if you haven't already got one. Kirsteen was born in Glasgow, Scotland, and lived in Toronto and Brazil. She now divides her time between Kingston, Ontario, and a riverside cabin in the woods near Bancroft. All this, and my favorite part, Kirsteen is curious, and we're so glad that she is so. This book is a beautiful study of the benefits of solitude and how that is helping us shape our world today. Please join me in welcoming Kirsteen to Kingston Writers Fest. I know you can't hear me clapping, but Kirsteen can as she comes on board.
Thank you so much, Kate, for the beautiful introduction. It's really nice to be talking to someone who's an aficionado of retreat. I don't have to convince you of the benefits. And I also wanted to thank Tricia and the Kingston Writers Fest for inviting me. And I'm really delighted to see that Wintergreen is my sponsor. So Wintergreen Studios is a wonderful retreat space in the Kingston vicinity. So yes, thanks to Wintergreen for that. It seems very fitting. And thanks to all of you for coming today.
Yes, I would add too on Wintergreen, it's a lovely stay in a lovely retreat space. And I believe this weekend they have their little bee pollinators. They're doing some harvesting of the honey on Sunday. So you should check out their website if you want more information about that. Now, the best juicy part. This book was such a gift, and I had other writer friends say to me, Kate, you're going to love this book, and they were so right. So I'm gonna do, I know you and I have discussed a little bit about the format, but I'd love to introduce you to read a little bit from the book, a section that possibly we discussed or one of your choosing. And then the format will be that we'll go into some Q&As from me, and then we'll have an opportunity from guests to offer questions as well, and possibly another short reading as well. We'll see how we go for time. Does that sound
okay?
All right.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. So Kate and I were discussing readings, and I kind of felt like Zoom is good for readings, but I find shorter readings better. So I decided that instead of reading from the introduction, which was one of our options, that maybe I'd read you a little bit about my cabin, which is basically my version of Walden Pond. And the cabin is the place that led to all the inner adventures that are described in this book. So it's a retreat to nature. And it's really amazing how transformative spending time in the natural world can actually be. So this will be kind of, if the book is the after, this is the before snapshot of how this transpired. And I really fell in love with the natural world and came to investigate the whole phenomenon, historical phenomenon of retreat, following in the footsteps of hermits and naturalists and all kinds of other marginal wild people. So this is from the chapter that's called Green Cathedral. The cabin is a mile down a winding logging road, deep in the green forest. There's no running water, unless you count the creek, and no electricity. It's far from everyone and everything. The bumpy road in is overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, and it ends at Beaver Creek. A rough footbridge spans the water, planks nailed between two tree trunks that were pulled into place by a neighbor's horse. We fill our arms with supplies from the truck and walk over. Drinking water, wine, cooler, bags of food, bedding and towels, maybe a saxophone, the stories of Chekhov, the hockey player, my husband, Marco Deadpans, or fat yoga and philosophy tomes we don't have time for in the city. Stepping onto the bridge's weathered boards, I feel something lift and wash away in the rush of water and wind and trees. It's the sensation of a gorgeous absence, as when a pain that had been constant suddenly vanishes, or when a noise unheard for always being heard disappears. All the cells of my body relax. Below, the creek pours on without beginning or end. At the far shore, I stepped between the tall poplar and the woodpecker riddled cedars and onto the land. Up ahead, the cabin, shaped like a tarny barn with cedar plank siding and a blue steel roof, rests amid tall trees. On the front porch, I peer into the mud and moss nest in the eaves, while two adult phoebes peep in alarm from a nearby maple sapling. 4 upturned beaks. This means we'll be using the back door again this spring until the babies fly. I pull out my keychain, a blue globe, and open the front door. Of all the places on this planet, this is where I feel most at peace. A retreat in the woods is the last thing I expected to have or even desire. For 20 years, I lived in Toronto. I loved cities. I had zero interest in wilderness. I thought it antisocial to spend time alone and would never have considered leaving the smoggy, edgy metropolis for a place where biting insects likely outnumbered people. No culture, no clubs, no cappuccino. I got uneasy at the very idea of being miles from a lemon, just like Reverend Sidney Smith, an English writer who once remarked of his new country parish. It was so out of the way that it was actually 12 miles from a lemon. Then, one summer, quite suddenly, I got fed up. I'd been working on contract for the provincial government, wondering how my journalism career as the next Oriana Fallaci had come to this. My boss was in a constant state of panic about legislation we were working on, and she paced, spritzing peppermint essence into the air. My friend and I, 2 lapsed magazine writers with no clue about how laws are made, lived in perpetual fear of getting fired. Each evening we'd ride the streetcar home together, limp from tension and amazed to still be employed. The money was stellar, but the days were consumed by absurd dramas and counterfeit crises. About the same time, home became inhospitable. Marco and I were renting a 3-bedroom brick semi with a small yard near St. Clair and Oakwood. Mighty Q107 rock blared nonstop in the yard next door. Out back, our neighbors kept their tiny city lots pristine by sticking all their junk out of sight behind their sheds, which was the view from our rear door. They hacked down trees, which they considered a messy nuisance that blocked sun from their tomatoes. Then, a dead body was found in the trunk of a car that had been parked outside our house for a week. Much later, Marco told me he never corrected the rumor that we were brother and sister, thus the hostile stares whenever we walked down the street holding hands. Worst of all, many bored kids lived nearby. They called to me, "Kay, what are you doing?" I longed to read in peace, so Marco constructed me a hideout in the back corner by our shed. He used the springs of a bed frame and let green beans grow all over it, an aesthetic not appreciated by our neighbors. They went more for garden gnomes and had a back gate sign that said, "Garden of Earthly Delights." I guarantee they weren't familiar with the painting. In my leafy retreat, there was just enough space for a chair. It was so pleasant in the dark green shade. Before long, the kids discovered me and their calls became ever more plaintive. One day, exasperated, I stood in the yard with my arms spread wide and shouted to the skies, "All I want is me squared of peace."
I muted myself so you couldn't catch me smiling and giggling. I reckon you need to do that in a really great, strong Scottish accent. That's fantastic. I think that we're all looking for that little square of peace. Yeah.
Yes, I didn't need much, just this much would have been good. What I ended up with was 47 acres that I didn't know what to do with at the beginning, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, I love your dad called it the little bolt hole. Everyone needs a little bolt hole.
Yeah, for when the apocalypse comes. He was one of the few people who approved of it in my circle. Nobody else could understand why we hid, why we fell in love with this place.
Well, it's funny, actually, I might even go to that question then, just because you bring it up. But,
Mhm.
we think about retreating and the necessary needs of solitude. So, your dad describes it as the bullet hole, but really that beautiful cabin in the woods, really that happened long before things like the state of COVID. It was many, many
Yes.
years ago. But that woods really did allow you to find that peace in a much wider space, in a much different way. And
Mhm.
do you want to just describe a little bit about how you kind of woke up to the interconnectedness of nature and us?
Mm. It's interesting. That's a good question, Kate. And it's sometimes hard to describe inner experiences, but I think that this is just something that naturally happens. So when you spend enough time in a quiet place and you stop with all the resistance that you might have, and you settle down because you're not tired anymore, or you arrive in this place and you think you're just going to have a relaxing time, but it turns out you haven't grieved for somebody who's died, and you spend the whole time doing that. So it's almost like the waters have to settle. And then once they start to settle, you really become aware of what's around you. And Mary Oliver, the poet, said that attention is the beginning of devotion. So I just think it really works that way. You start to pay attention and you start to fall in love with what's around you. And the more time you can spend in a quiet place, settled and paying attention, the more you start to see other patterns of reality that is really hard to see in the rush of our everyday lives. So a retreat is kind of like the other half of experience, the reflective and the solitary. And it has a lot to offer. But I think in our busy modern world, we've forgotten what it has to offer, and we've become very one-sided. Um, so these insights kind of arise naturally once you do spend time in nature. And the idea of human retreats, they've always been in natural places. So in fact, they were holy rivers. That's where people would go to worship, or sacred groves. In the modern day, cabins in the woods are perhaps our prototypical one, at least in North America, based on Thoreau's influence. But yeah, it's that's what happened. I settled, and then I began to see things really differently.
Yeah. And Thoreau, actually, so it's, it might get this wrong, but it's Henry David Thoreau, but he says to wake up is to be alive. And really that connection with nature and that small cabin in the woods really allowed you to do that, and retreat to a space that, yeah, you could leave the city behind. And
Hmm.
I'm finding too that, we have such a struggle between action versus contemplation, and
Hmm.
the constant battle between the two. But,
Yeah.
there's, you were wise to get out of the city when you did. And now many people are doing the same. They're retreating to smaller places and off-grid locations and things like
Mm.
that. So do you think that people are actually starting to really identify the benefit of retreat and solitude?
It's interesting, Kate, because when I wrote this book and when I went to the cabin, there was no pandemic. So I wrote most of this book except for the epilogue before the pandemic. So I wasn't trying to get away from something. I was moving towards something, it felt like, more. And there's a chapter in this book that kind of goes on and on. It might seem like it goes on and on now because I was trying to defend the whole idea of retreat, because I thought I really needed to defend it and say why it was good and convince people about it. Well, it reads really differently now, because I don't think people need to be convinced as much. I think, one of the first things that happened with the pandemic is people started to take solace in nature. Not everybody, of course. If you're a healthcare worker or your whole family's at home, and you're trying to work or whatever, then your experience has been different. But quite a few people actually felt like they had permission, I think, and started to take solace in nature, in solitary and reflective um, time for themselves, and start to be a lot more open to what that has to offer than I think perhaps before the pandemic. So it reads a lot more like a survival guide, this book, than it was meant to. But luckily, many of the things I've written about hold true, about the benefits of retreating. The distinction that I made, actually, because I had to stop somewhere with the research, was that I wanted it to be a voluntary step back. So there's lots of times that people have involuntarily stepped back, but I feel like that's a whole different thing. So even though our pandemic experiences are not a retreat, it is probably a bit more of a familiarization, whether it's a forced pause or whether we embrace it. I do feel like people are far more open to the kinds of things you can experience on these inner adventures that we go on.
I want to go back to what you said too about it being you were walking towards something. You were moving towards something when you went on to retreat in Bancroft to find that little tool. But
Yeah.
it is interesting. I loved also in the book how you described, you retreated to several countries even to take space away. And I think you were reflecting in one retreat space where you were referring back to the Bancroft cabin. You were sharing that experience with them and found that you could just so close to home, we could still find that same inner peace.
Yes.
To be at a retreat in India. Yes.
That's right. Well, things sort of snowballed. So first of all, I shouldn't say that I totally was moving towards something. It was unconscious. I think there was a bit of an unconscious desire. At first, it was more like that poem of Dorothy Parker. I don't know if anyone's read Sanctuary. She wanted to get away from all the things that had happened to her and her burning bridges. So there was some of that at the beginning. Then I started to really fill myself up and it transformed my life. I left Toronto. I moved to Kingston to be closer to the cabin. I've really changed what I was doing for my life. I'm no longer working for the government, for instance, doing some other long deferred things like teaching yoga and other kinds of writing. But then I started to wonder, how is it possible there was this rich inner dimension that I didn't know anything about? And so I got curious about, what is it I love about this so much? And what is it that a gentler, kind of quieter, slower kind of life has to offer? And I think that's no coincidence. Many times people around the age of 40 start to wonder about these things as well. I think it's age related as well, although the seeds may have been there when you were much younger. And then I started to think, well, what's the history of this tradition of retreating? And when I got into that, I just went crazy with the research. I was so fascinated to find out that I was following the footsteps of all of these people since, time immemorial, basically. People have been retreating to nature usually in order to connect to themselves and also to connect to larger forces. So whether that's, spirit or nature or art or whatever it is that we love most, it's drawing back to spend some time in contemplation and reflection. And that knowledge, with so many religious figures or with Thoreau, who left Walden and began fighting against slavery, it's kind of like focusing on what it is that's most important to you and then figuring out how to act on that when you come out of retreat. So I got so fascinated by that then I ended up, going to Scotland where there had been hermits all over the place to do some research about hermits, or, going to India for a yoga retreat, or I happened to be going to see relatives in Brazil, so I did a little bit of pilgrimage research while I was there. I just got really, really curious about all the past traditions that have led to our retreats today.
Can you describe when you were actually staying in a hermitage and that I think it was a hermitage, yes, that the parishioners said, but you don't have the long beard and you don't get the look of a hermit, but really, did you want to describe how you felt in that moment? How do you...
That was actually somebody else who was a professional hermit who got a job in Switzerland. And the guy he didn't do very well. He didn't last. He was a psychologist somewhere in Switzerland where they'd had a hermit in the cave, and they actually have job ads. He applied for a job ad and won, and he was there for less than a year. And he said that the people didn't like him, and he was speculating it was because he wasn't wearing a cowl and he didn't have a beard.
Well, apologies if I got that wrong. So
yeah, so there still is such a thing as a professional hermit, right?
I always think that I may be a professional hermit, but I do have to be pulled out from my house once in a while. Well, that being said, I know that you spent a lot of time on retreat, and each one of these experiences are influence us and change us in some way. And with sometimes artists, as you are a writer and you would often be taking projects possibly to these sites, but do you find that you're working on that project when you're in retreat, or does it change sometime? And you want to explain that a little bit in more detail?
Yeah, it kind of depends. Like for anybody, it depends what your purpose is, right? So you might be the first retreat I ever went on, I phoned the Dharma Center of Canada, and they said, well, you can't just come here. It's not a bed and breakfast. I just want to get out of the city. And I said, okay, well, what if I just want to come and sleep? And they said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. So it's the purposefulness that's the important thing. So sometimes I go on a retreat, like at the cabin. I wasn't ever thinking about this being the beginning of a book, and I didn't write anything. When I went to the Hermitage in Scotland, in the north of Scotland, I was actively trying to enter a space where ancient hermits had been, and I was studying hermits while I was up there. When I went on an arts retreat, I had a project, but you never know what's going to happen. Retreats are very unpredictable. So I took some poetry to the castle in Edinburgh where I was on a writing retreat and didn't work on that at all and got really obsessed by monks. And anybody who's read my book, if you look in the notes at the back, there's all this stuff in there. I almost went berserk because I tried to write a chapter that was called A Short History of Monasticism. Which is kind of a long thing to do a short history of. I almost went crazy. So a lot of it I couldn't use, but it's in the notes in the back if you're really interested in hermits or monks or.
Well, since you spoke about that retreat, I'm also going to note, like, you're right, anything can happen on these retreats. And you went to, one day you had left and gone to a garden local nearby, and you ended up finding that you were still found your sanctuary in the botanical, I think it was I've got notes actually, let me have a look at my notes, but it was the Cathedral of the Trees that you were most interested in, and there was a sculpture there that you were taken with. And want to describe?
That's right. Yeah, it was the woodland section. I found myself in the botanical garden in Edinburgh, hanging out in the woodland section and wondering why I was enjoying it so much. And you're quite right. In India, you know, instead of talking about all the things that happened on retreat, there were a lot of people at this place we were staying, and they seemed interested. So I kept telling them all these stories about the cabin. And so, you know, we did a lot of traveling, partly for research or partly for retreat experiences that my partner Marco and I went on. But that was the big discovery, is that, you know, you don't need to go anywhere. It's also a state of mind and heart. So it's easier if you can take yourself off somewhere to get used to retreating. And then when you're back in your everyday life, you can find those same states of mind and heart in your everyday life, taking a walk in the park or listening to some beautiful music or doing your yoga practice or things like that. So I think that's the whole goal of retreat. What I learned is that by physically taking yourself into these quiet and reflective spaces, it's like you take it in. So it becomes an inner place that you can go to. And when you think about the sanctuary, so the sanctuary to me is the natural world, but it's also us, right? We have two geographies, right? We have the earth and we have our bodies. So those are the two places that you can really go to find sanctuary or to retreat to. So yeah, it's a very interesting development that the outer and the inner reflect one another.
Yeah, and you know, when we talk about our decisions as human, like little small things, even just taking those breaks away and things, I know that often people can think, you know, and you mention it in your book, so I'm not bringing up anything I shouldn't, but you mention and describe how Mary Oliver, when she lived in the reserve in the park, and how she describes the benefits of being in that space. And people could say retreating is an action. You know, you're retreating and you're kind of burying your head in the sand, as you said in your book, instead of actually actively helping to support that, you know, ecological factors that are happening. But it can be just as rewarding. Did you want to describe that portion? Maybe describe Mary Oliver's thoughts on it and then your reasoning.
Yeah, like I think a lot of people, the word retreat, I complain about it in the book because in the West, we think of it as passive and running away and all these things. In the East, actually, it's considered the realm of possibility. So, you know, someone like Mary Oliver, or when we go to nature, the idea is not necessarily, everyone's different, so the dosage will be different, or how you use your retreats will be really different. But the idea is, for religious leaders, you know, from Jesus to Muhammad, like all kinds of religious people took retreats, like 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. It's a pretty standard kind of retreat that people can do. You know, Thoreau, like lots of people are trying to connect to themselves, connect to what they most deeply love and what's most meaningful. And then when you leave, it guides your actions. So I think of retreat as being something that's very active. You're connecting to what you love most and what you want to preserve. And then that guides your actions when you leave. So, Thoreau, the same Thoreau who is at Walden Pond, the same, he meant for that to be an experiment. It was 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, and then he left. That was his experiment. That's what he set out to do. But that's the same person who then left and got involved in activism and anti-slavery movement, right? So what he learned by going into himself and being in the natural world, what he learned about how he wanted to be, about living deliberately, I think was the way he put it, was reflected in his actions. So I would argue that retreating is actually action as well, and that people who are just in action all the time, sometimes that's an easier distraction. So just keeping yourself busy all the time doesn't mean, that you're necessarily doing better than somebody who draws back to get clear. And
Yeah.
then, and retreating has always been the way to get brave new ideas and wisdom. It's always been connected to wisdom traditions. So I don't know, you talked a little bit before about how there's this, it's almost like a pendulum swing between the active and social and the more solitary and reflective. And I just feel like the pendulum is swung way over to the social and active to such a degree that we can't really see what's missing. It's like, and I feel like it's like you're looking out of only one eye. And right now, I think one of the most important things you can do is to actually connect to what's most deeply important to you and to start to see the patterns of reality and the web, the living web that we're part of. Because there is a real need to fall in love with the natural world that's our home and to protect the sanctuary, right? So to me, it's actually urgent activism. And some people, like I said, the dosage is different for everybody. And it's not to say that people who, are spending their time completely as activists, I mean, that's also great, right? But I just think, why does it have to be one or the other? I think we need a more holistic perspective, and that a lot of the problems that we have, environmental and other, are created by this fragmentation, this idea of us as separate, this lack of understanding of the natural web of things. We get very disembodied and out of touch when we're busy all the time, right? Or most people, we've officially become an urban species, right? More people live in cities now than anywhere else. So, that connection is very, very important with the natural world
You
to
raised
create a
so
holistic
many,
sense.
you raised so many points. I'm like, I want to attach to each one. Thank you, because it does. I do believe in action, but I also think that if we even go back to history shows, the desert fathers spent time in the desert on pilgrimages by holding space for what was happening in the world too, because we forget that even just that any small change we make affects another. And so just having that time of reflection, I mean, without saying too much on the COVID topic, because I feel like we're all over it. But I think that it really did give us an opportunity to stop and pause and to revisit quantum mechanics and how that fundamentally plays into how nature and atoms and things all work together, and taking that time to just be in space with it and be just in solitude can be just as beneficial as rushing out to do something. I also think too that we're sheep, and people jump on board on an idea and they're actively seeking a solution. I think if you asked 5 of them, they wouldn't know why they're doing it necessarily. The leader might, but even the leader forgets. So, we're all teachers to each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, and like Thoreau he was criticizing society. That's why he stepped back. He was he lived in a very difficult time. It was a time where in the news every day, it was the settlers, burning the indigenous people out of their lands. It was industrialization. In fact, Walden is not a natural place, in the wild somewhere. It was actually on the edge of commerce. It was a place that nobody wanted because the road that used to pass by there, a new road was built, and so nobody went that way anymore. And all the trees were being cut down, and there were trains going by there and stuff. He lived in a very difficult time, and he was very critical of society. So he just went to really have a think, to become aware, and to decide for himself. He thought people were sheep as well, Kate. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. He really thought there was this conformity, right? And the transcendentalists really were objecting to the conformity of people and wanting to step back and think clearly and then act deliberately. So,
can you actually explain for those who don't know what being transcendentalist is?
Yeah, the transcendentalists are interesting.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. The transcendentalists were from New England, and they were in reaction against the Unitarian Church. So they thought the Unitarians were very materialistic and rational, and they thought that, and so they were against that. They just thought that that was conformist, and they didn't like the idea that you needed a religion to be able to contact the divine. They thought that everybody could do that personally. So they saw the divine in everything. So they thought the divine was in every blade of grass, and you could contact it in the natural world most easily. And they also thought it was transcendent, so beyond human understanding. So they were a reaction against the puritanical sort of forces of religion in New England of their time. And there were a number of them who were very influential. It's hard to summarize them because when you start to look into it, all of them had slightly different ideas. But basically, it is that move away from religion and that idea about a personal connection to the divine, that we all can have that, and the natural world is a good place to start to connect to those larger forces. And if you read Walden, there are a lot of times where he really has these sort of ecstatic moments of feeling at one with the universe. So yeah, it's very interesting. He finds
which ties me back to why when you were in your cabin in Bancroft, that interconnectedness does exist. The quieter you get, I mean, you explained in the book, listening to the birds and the bird family, sitting in a spot and you decide you're going to use the other door instead of going out that door. I mean, each little decision matters, right? And going back to Thoreau, David Henry Thoreau, he writes, when he speaks of being transcendentalist, was that he just has no sympathy for bigotry and ignorance. And so he didn't prefer a religion or a philosophy. He liked to be interested in all of them, which I can totally get my head around. I think that to me is really, he was looking at all religions, but not only all religions, all philosophies of life, and did see it in nature. Now, you also touch on it in the book, so I'm going to bring it up, that people are less religious today, but studies show that we're not less spiritual, and we're simply finding new ways to seek meaning. Even though religion is declining, people still believe in God or divine or spirit, and we call it many things. Why do you think it is that many people get so charged up about the use of religious words?
Yeah, that's interesting. I had some complaints about that actually, and I do talk about this in the book. I don't think there are other words really available. So it's changed fairly recently from most of us going to church and being religious and part of organized religion. So all the words we have for things like sacred or reverence or sanctuary, I searched for a word that was a less religious word in the subtitle of my book. It's impossible to find them because we haven't invented them yet. So this is a fairly new thing that we are starting to we're starting to change. What's becoming the biggest faith group is what they call nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And so if what religion are you? And people check off none, but they say that they're spiritual but not religious. So just in the same way that we may no longer be building cathedrals, we could be building spaces like with the Rothko Chapel or something that's non-denominational, but that inspires awe and reverence. We need to reinvent our language for the new reality, and we haven't really done that yet. So I looked to the poets at one point. Marie Howe is a poet who writes a lot about the sacred. Yeah, and that's the conclusion she came to as well, that we're in the process of reinventing that now. So reinventing the connection to the divine and the, and that can be, listening to music. Some people find that a transcendental experience. It can be, reading, it can be yoga, it can be going to church, it can be many different things. But a lot of people are finding Thoreau to be quite relevant. His thoughts were very relevant. It seems incredible that he was saying many of the things back then that are now coming to pass. So I think it's no surprise that he seems quite contemporary and modern. Some of his ideas, his ecological ideas, his ideas about finding the divine inside each individual. It's a very fascinating, if quixotic figure.
Yeah, no, I'm excited by the change of frameworks. I think that we've seen a lot that's happened, obviously, within our Indigenous communities in Canada, but also us, the church, in some way finding a way to connect and speak it in a different way, because churches were a sanctuary. They were a place to retreat, and they should still be a safe space, as should the land. And we need to find ways to speak that in a way that that doesn't cause us to wriggle in our seats when we speak of God or the divine. To me, we are definitely on a threshold of something. I'm looking at the time, and I'd like to just open it up to some questions, but I still have lots of questions too.
We'll have to have coffee sometime soon.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll open the Q&A section, and maybe if there's not that many questions, I can ask them. Okay. All right. So the first question is from Julie. Can you explain again the difference between retreating, the way you experience it, and escapism, where, for example, one would read a whole book in a day to retreat from everyday life? And does it have to do with intention?
So the difference, can I just say that back to make sure I got it? So the difference between retreat and escapism?
Yeah.
Did I get all of it?
Well, it's talking about the fact that, when you take that time out and you just read a book the entire day, are you escaping or are you retreating?
I see. Yeah, I think it is about intention, actually. So the way that I defined retreat was that it was taking a step back from your everyday life into a quiet space for a purpose. So sometimes the purpose doesn't end up being what you do, but I think it is about that intentionality, actually. So if you read a whole book, maybe that's what you need to do, or if you sleep for a week, all of these things, it's kind of like a change of altitude. I guess that's the way I think about it. So it takes a while to acclimatize to it. So, you can't expect a big transformation to take place in a weekend necessarily. I mean, sometimes things like that happen, but, it might be that you sleep or or you hate it and decide you're going to leave because your brain is too busy. Like Leonard Cohen did that actually the first time he went on a retreat and ended up becoming a Buddhist monk later. So these things are common as you acclimatize. So I think, as long as you've got the intention to step back in the spirit of retreat, which is to have a reflective, more solitary experience. And solitary doesn't mean necessarily being by yourself. You can be on a yoga retreat and be in a community of like-minded others. So yeah, I think the intention is the thing. And if you read a book and, are filling your well, I think that's great. I think that counts as a retreat. But I mean, all of these things, I defined retreat for lack of a better term. So that's the way I defined it, but not everybody might.
You're right, though, going back to that point that you made about retreat doesn't necessarily need to be solitude, because you actually traveled a lot with Marco, your partner. And really, I loved it, actually. I remember you explaining in the book about how you had all these collections of books at the cabin, and you would take one down and read by candlelight together. And I thought, oh, how fantastic, because Thoreau writes that, I've never found a companion more compatible than solitude. But
that's right. But even the hermits were never alone. Like St. Anthony had to run into the desert. His followers broke him out of a tomb, so he couldn't be alone. So he ran further into the desert, and then they kept following him. And that's how the first monastery started, was because the followers wouldn't leave him. So even hermits, the most solitary of people, are usually not in pure solitude. So yeah, that's not necessary.
And now someone else had a question about the name of the writer that you mentioned. Was it Mary Hallett?
Oh, Marie Howe, perhaps, the poet who she wrote a book called Magdalene and many other ones that are really beautiful. And yeah, she's an American poet. It's Marie Howe. So she writes a lot about the sacred, and I found lots of interesting things of her readings online too. So you might do a YouTube search if you're interested in hearing her lectures or readings. She's brilliant. I love her.
Well, I'm interested in reading. I've read a bit on Mary Magdalene, which is always fascinating considering I identify as Christian, but I always find it very interesting reading all philosophies around theories. But there's a couple more questions here. Other than wintergreen, would you recommend going on retreat near Kingston or in Ontario?
Oh, that's a hard one for me just because I have my place that I always go to, and we always complain that we always end up there. But I mean, if you're retreating, I think as long as if you can, like Ontario is a fantastic place for that, especially because we have all these resources close by, all these lakes. So I just would say wintergreen is a great place because the structure is already there. So if you've never retreated before, sometimes finding a place where the structure is there already is a really great thing. You know, there's a place, a yoga retreat, the Shivananda Center is near Montreal. If you look up retreats, there's a lot of places around that you can go that are already set up. So there's somebody who organizes all of that for you. If you really feel like doing it on your own, then just make sure that you're at a place where there won't be ATVs roaring up and down and things like that. Not that you can't find a quiet space amid noise, but it's kind of like learning to drive. Like at first you won't go on the highway, you'll go on the small roads, and then you'll go on the big road, right? So same thing with retreat. You might want to start on the small roads, which is where somebody else is organizing everything so that you can really focus on your inner experience. That can be extremely helpful. Someone else is doing the meals or making sure there's silence if it's that kind of retreat. And then maybe starting to retreat on your own, you'll have some familiarity so that it won't feel too strange. Like I said, a change of altitude. So make it suit your level of retreat experience. But wintergreen is a great place to start. I've done poetry retreats up there that were just fantastic. It's really beautiful and close. And yeah, I'm sure you'll find many places in Ontario.
Yeah, I agree. Now, there was another question as well, because people were asking a little bit more about where, if you were Googling and things like that. And I said, there is Ontario, but I know at the moment we're still in, we're not traveling as much, but I would say resartiste.org is a fantastic one internationally to look at retreats. But whether you're, I remember one artist telling me everyone should gift themselves a retreat. And it really is true, whether you're a creative or not, having that time to be creative is really essential.
Yeah, and there's arts retreats in Prince Edward counties, like as well. I can't think of the names of them right off the top of my head, but yeah, like do a search. You'll find some places depending on what kind of retreat you're looking for.
Okay, well, Alexandra, sorry, has a question and said, what advice would you have for a young couple desiring to spend time together regularly in retreat? And you're the perfect person for this question, I think.
I was just thinking that's a hard one for me because for one thing, I'm not young. And for another thing, I don't really know if you are nature retreat people, if you're yoga retreat people, if you're meditation retreat people, if you would rather go to a center, if you would rather be on your own. So that's kind of a hard one, but I don't know what your resources are. Like that really depends as well. Retreating isn't just for the privileged. There are also many places you can go and do work studies and things like that. I don't know what time period you're talking about. The work studies are usually minimum of a month to go spend in a yoga center helping with the garden or the cooking or something like that. So that's a super hard one for me to answer, I'm afraid.
Well, I'm not young either, but I will give the answer another perspective in that I remember walking the Camino de Santiago and a couple who had just started dating walked it together. They were a young couple. And I thought, fantastic, because if you're going to learn about each other, 30 days of walking, 20 to 30 kilometers a day is a really great way to find out if you're compatible. So there's that. The other thing is, I think that any retreat, is an opportunity. It's inward journey. So you can still have that being in opposite ends of a house. It's just that you need to allow that person that time to do their inner work too. You can't be that, would you say that's sometimes how you and Marco make it work? That you make sure that you each have your space?
Well, I mean, it works sometimes and it doesn't always work because, I think he's forbidden me from going on Buddhist retreats with him because we've gone on a silent retreat where I got ridiculous and was laughing loudly and things like that. So I think I'm forbidden from going. But yeah, yeah, I guess it's been more organic because we've been together for a really long time. But I would say if you wanted to experience retreat together and you have the resources, beg or borrow a cabin or a cottage if you can. And if you can't do that, like if you're in Kingston, Prince Edward County at this time of year and over the off season is a really great place. Like the skies are beautiful. There's nice places to go for a walk and things. I would either choose the county or somewhere, north of Kingston if you're in this area and just rent yourself a little place if you can, because those landscapes are really conducive, I would say, to the reflective and more solitary. And like Marco and I would do our own things in the day. He'd go out in the hills and I'd be working, and then we'd have dinner together. So doing something like that also can work.
Yeah, I like that. There's another question as well, one that's lovely, it's anonymous, but they've said, Kirsteen, you are inspiring and enthusiastic. I could also relate with you. You mentioned you went to India and Edinburgh for retreat. How was your experience in India?
I loved India. India was just fantastic. And India's kind of the perfect place to go for a retreat. I was just saying that it's often unpredictable. You don't really know what's going to happen. And in India, you never know from moment to moment what's going to happen. It just opens you right up to new experiences. And any of you who have read the book are probably laughing because you'll know that in the book I read about this disastrous yoga retreat I had, and I had a falling out with my teacher. And I think I've only just gotten over it, and that was in 2008. But that's the thing about a retreat. It doesn't necessarily have to be like, it's not like we're looking for a positive, it's not like we have an expectation and then we go execute it, right? We're not looking necessarily for a positive experience. It just could be a really important learning experience. And in the case of my doomed yoga retreat, it was one of the best learning experiences I've ever had. I got so much understanding out of that, even though it was painful. So I don't want to make it sound like it's all idyllic because it certainly isn't. And especially the deeper you go, the more things can come up that can be a little bit difficult to deal with, but that's part of it. It's an inner adventure. It's just like going up a mountain. There's as many peaks and valleys on the inner adventure. And that's one of the things I found so amazing. Like I never saw the need to have a quieter, more reflective life. I got this cabin, and now I'm seeing that the inner terrain is just as vast as the outer terrain when I thought there was nothing there. So it's like any kind of practice, like yoga or playing an instrument or anything. The more you do it, the more practice, the more you're going to get out of it. So it can be a weekend to read your book. It can be, Leonard Cohen, who spent most of his life in one way or another, either in Zen retreat or artistic retreats. His Tower of Song was a real thing. Like he had a white room where he went to retreat and he connected to his work, and that was sacred to him. So it's going to be a matter of degree and, what feels like the right dosage for you. But I just really hope that people won't not notice that the pendulum has swung all the way over to social and active, and that they will, at least dip their toes in the reflective and solitary to see what that has to offer. And for me, it was transformational. I live in Kingston. What I do with my time is totally different. It's led to many things.
Yeah, I mean,
I never expected.
No, and I think that again, we go back to retreats are for everyone. You're that taking that time out to gift yourself solitude, to slow down. I often say that's why I like to walk. I mean, and I love walking my dogs, but sometimes they're going faster than I want to go, even because I want to take that time to just see everything and to experience everything. I wanted you to read another section of your book, but I don't think we're going to have time. But I love that you brought up Leonard Cohen, because he's probably my other favorite Canadian, is just like you. And he did right to the end. He spent time retreating and giving himself that and really honoring that. And I think I remember him being at a Buddhist retreat and still practicing his Judaism. And someone said,
Yeah.
you're here. And he's like, but I'm still Jewish. Like, it's kind of like culturally, it's who you are. And he
Yeah.
practiced all, and it didn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah, he said it was part of the uniform. Like he wanted to be with his teacher, and so he had to become a monk in order to stay there. So for him, it was like the robes part of the uniform. He was still Jewish, but he would do anything to be able to be near his teacher. So that was what it took.
Just lovely.
Mhm.
You submitted this book on December 31st, and so much has happened.
I know.
I know with all your research and experience, you must just kind of go, wow, I didn't see that coming. But do you find that you now find that same peace in a crowd? Do you find that inner peace?
You know, it's a work in progress, I think, for everybody. There have been times in my life where I was far more peaceful than I am right now. So you just, it's like they talk about that metaphor of peeling an onion, like it's always something a little bit different, isn't it? Like I think I've gotten more skilled at noticing when I'm getting distracted and when I'm getting kind of fragmented in my thinking and when I'm getting stressed and things, and I have more tools to know what to do about it. But life is filled with the unexpected. So, you never quite know sometimes what's going on underground that's creating some turbulence for you. But I've got to say, like I never had a slowed down reflective life, and it's just meant everything to me. It's like a gem that I have in my pocket that I can kind of take out when I need to just look at something beautiful. And Pascal said, always, especially in difficult times, always keep something beautiful in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I've gotten much better at that aspect of it. So yeah, I still can be. I was a very sped up person. I mean, this is me after a lot of yoga and a lot of retreats. So maybe you can imagine. I am kind of enthusiastic and I get excited, and I'm an excitable person, really. So yeah. So I wouldn't say,
I remember meeting you, and I was at that time in my life, which was 10 years ago, and so much has slowed down, and I'm grateful for all of it. But I definitely think that when you can hold gratitude and a sense of beauty even in the dark times, like you mentioned grief before, finding that way to just know the light is going to be there, right? And so many people spend time. I think actually you talked about an artist that you were with in Scotland, actually, who said, oh, you went to that garden, and how long did you spend? 3 hours? And you went, yeah. And they went, well, that would have been long enough.
Because 3 hours is enough to be in the garden. It's interesting because actually the word paradise means an enclosed garden. So really I think of paradise in a way as being like a retreat, because it's a space outside of your everyday life. A sacred precinct is what Leonard Cohen called it sometimes, where you go to do your meaningful work, your soul making work in safety, and just to settle and to, set your inner compass to match your inner dictates. So I think when I started the journey with the book, I didn't realize that my inner dictates were out of line with how I was living. So that's what Retreat did for me. It integrated those and aligned them so that I was on the same trajectory on the inside as the outside. So when you change inside, of course, lots of things change on the outside. So be prepared for an adventure if you do take a retreating path, because I sometimes wish people would put a warning sign. Warning, retreat will lead to changes, new ideas.
Yeah, well, I'm getting the wind down, and honestly, I could speak
the cane
forever. We're gonna have a walk very soon.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I have one sentence I wanted to close with, though, because you write this at the end of the book, and I wanted you to read some more of the book, but we're not going to have time. But you say humans long to connect with beauty, truth, nature, and spirit. Doing so helps us amplify the good and endure much. And I agree, it really, really does. So thank you, Kirsteen Macleod. In Praise of Retreat is available at our festival bookstore, Novel Idea, and online. Thank you, Kirsteen.
Oh, thank you so much for the engaged conversation, Kate. That was really wonderful. Yeah, I really appreciate your kind attention and your great questions. Yeah, and thank you all so much for coming. That was really enjoyable. Thank you, Tricia. And yeah, it's another great festival. It's always like a wonderful, wonderful time. It's the most exciting week of the year for many of us here in Kingston. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much to both of you, Kirsteen and to Kate. I think we're all thinking about where to retreat this fall after that. Just a spectacular conversation. And a special thank you to Justin Canidis and to Wintergreen Studios for sponsoring this event. I did throw up a link to Wintergreen Studios in the chat, but it's the only one in the area, so very easy to Google as well. We'd like to congratulate Susan Mockler, who has won a copy of Kirsteen's In Praise of Retreat, which I will be going to Novel Idea to pick up a copy of. I can't wait. And if you're joining us from outside of KFLNA, please do consider supporting the authors. And if you have one, your local independent bookstore. Thank you for joining us. And if you want more with nature, especially Helen Humphreys is joining us tomorrow morning at 11. Be sure to check out that event and others. We've got events going right through until Sunday evening, kingstonwritersfest.ca for the rest of our great lineup. And thank you all for sharing your time and energy with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
See you at other events. Everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.